At sunrise, 60 coffins draped in the national flag were carried into the capital. It was not just a funeral, it was a reckoning. For Burkina Faso, the loss of 60 soldiers in a single ambush was more than a military tragedy. It was a symbolic wound, opened just days after a Western delegation arrived in Ouagadougou offering cooperation. President Ibrahim Traoré refused, and then silence was weaponized. Drones failed, radios died. The attack was surgical. The question that followed burned through every village and city. Was this a coincidence, or the cost of saying no? This is no longer just a national inquiry. It is a continental moment. A moment where the meaning of sovereignty is no longer theoretical, but tested in blood, in steel, and in silence. And in that silence, a doctrine began to form, not in foreign capitals, but in the hearts of citizens. Stay with us. This is not just a story of war. It is the awakening of a continent. Subscribe and follow Burkina Faso's most decisive chapter yet. It happened at dawn, the hour when silence is deepest and trust is often thinnest. A battalion of Burkina Faso's finest was moving through a known conflict corridor, equipped with standard communications, surveillance drones, and confidence rooted in recent victories. What followed was not a battle. It was an erasure. Within 2 minutes, every radio went dark. Field signals blinked out. The drones circling overhead, eyes that had guided so many previous missions, simply disconnected, as if someone had reached down from the sky and unplugged the war. Then came the gunfire. Precise, coordinated, relentless. By the time reinforcements arrived, the ground was littered not with combatants, but with flag-draped brothers. 60 soldiers, 60 names. 60 families plunged into grief. National television didn't air press conferences. It aired funerals. Billboards didn't promote products. They bore the faces of the fallen. Streets in Ouagadougou were filled not with protest or anger, but with questions. How could an insurgent group, armed with hand-me-down rifles and stolen trucks, pull off such a clean, silent ambush? And that's when President Ibrahim Traoré said the words that would echo far beyond the borders of Burkina Faso. They were not just soldiers. They were our voice. So I ask, not who fired the shots, but who killed the sky. The room where he posed the question fell silent. His inquiry was not about insurgents. It was about satellites, about signal interference, about what flew above the Sahel in the 6 hours before the attack. It was not an accusation, but it was a lightning rod. Because just days earlier, a delegation had landed from the West, offering cooperation, partnership, support. Traoré, true to the doctrine he had slowly been shaping, declined, not with hostility, with clarity. Sovereignty would not be traded for security, and now 60 coffins were being carried into the capital. Coincidence? The media, once cautious in tone, became unusually bold. Editorials asked questions that had long been whispered, but rarely printed. One headline read, "By rejecting the West, are we reminded who still holds the trigger?" University students painted banners, "Dignity has a cost, and we are paying it." Markets buzzed with rumors. Villages mourned and speculated. Children carried flowers. Mothers wept openly in public squares. But beneath the sorrow, a sharper feeling emerged. Suspicion. Because the precision of the attack wasn't just deadly. It was familiar. It resembled the kind of coordination that insurgent groups alone do not possess. The kind that requires satellites. The kind that demands access to military-grade signal jammers and flight data. For 3 days, Burkina Faso stood still. Not paralyzed by grief, but focused by doubt. And Traoré did not escalate. He did not accuse. He did something deeper. He signed a decree. Not a speech. Not a blame game. A structural overhaul of the military chain of command. New protocols. New redundancies. New layers of protection against the one vulnerability no army should ever face. Betrayal from above. To some, this was restraint. To others, it was a chess move. Because while the country buried its sons, it also began building the first walls of a doctrine. A doctrine not just of reaction, but of preparation. And so the 60 coffins became more than tragedy. They became symbols. But symbols of what? Was this national funeral simply a moment of remembrance? Or was it the opening chapter in a continental confrontation between Africa's right to choose its own path and the invisible hands that still pulled the strings? Because if the sky can be stolen, then sovereignty itself is under siege. And if silence can be engineered, then perhaps the time has come for Africa to raise its voice, not just in grief, but in defiance. 3 days of mourning, 60 coffins, one question that refused to die. From Ouagadougou to the most remote villages, a silence heavier than grief settled over the country. It was not just mourning, it was awakening. Their faces were everywhere, on screens, on billboards, on the walls of schools and bus stops. They were no longer names on a military roster. They had become symbols of something deeper, a sacrifice not just of life, but of trust. In university courtyards, students unrolled banners scrawled with sharp truths. Dignity has a cost, and we are paying it. Who owns the sky? In marketplaces, the same questions that filled academic halls were whispered by merchants and mothers. Was this ambush truly the act of local insurgents, or was there a hidden message delivered in blood? The press, normally cautious, found new courage. One publication broke precedent with a headline that reverberated like a drumbeat. By rejecting the West, we are reminded who still holds the trigger. It was not just an article. It was an indictment. Artists joined the chorus. Musicians released haunting ballads of sorrow and suspicion. Murals appeared overnight. Soldiers with shattered radios, eyes turned to the sky, their hands raised not in surrender, but in unanswered prayer. Even traditional griots, the storytellers of West Africa, spoke not only of fallen warriors, but of invisible battles above the clouds. The legends they recited no longer lived in the past. They now had coordinates, timestamps, silence engineered. And yet, in the heart of this collective ache, Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood still. He did not hold a rally. He did not raise his fist. He stood beside the coffins as one among the mourners. When he spoke, it was not with anger. It was with clarity. We do not bury them in silence. We bury them in resolve. Then came the decree. Without naming names or feeding speculation, Traoré acted. He restructured the military's command lines. He redirected resources toward cyber defense and signal integrity. He established a unit tasked specifically with monitoring external aerial activity. And most strikingly, he called upon citizens to prepare themselves not just for defense, but for responsibility. To many, this was unexpected. The world anticipated outrage. He gave them order. But behind that calm was a deeper shift. The funeral, once a private national sorrow, was becoming the foundation of something bigger. An ideology born not in theory, but in necessity. A doctrine not drafted by foreign consultants, but by grief itself. And so, suspicion did not fragment the country. It focused it. Teachers began holding open forums in schools titled, "What Does Sovereignty Mean?" Elders met with youth in village circles to retell the meaning of independence. Tailors sewed black armbands, not just for mourning, but as daily reminders of vigilance. This was no longer only about the 60 fallen. It was about the next 60 that must not fall. It was about a new kind of wall, not built of concrete, but of memory and participation. And in this atmosphere, the whisper became a murmur. The murmur, a movement. Could Burkina Faso's national tragedy become the birth of an African doctrine? One that refuses to outsource defense? One that doesn't confuse foreign aid with freedom? Could grief be the seed of resistance? Could suspicion, when channeled with clarity, become strategy? These were no longer rhetorical questions. They were being tested every hour in the decisions made by government, military, and citizen alike. And so, as the final coffin was lowered into the earth, no gun salute echoed. Instead, the crowd stood in collective silence. Then, without a signal, a chant began, "Never again with borrowed wings." It wasn't rage. It was recognition. The sky may have been taken, but the ground still belonged to the people. And now, the question that hovered over every burial mound remained. Can this ground become the foundation for a doctrine the world cannot break? Out of the silence of mourning, a doctrine began to rise, not whispered in embassies or penned in policy rooms, but forged in the streets, classrooms, markets, and barracks of Burkina Faso. Captain Ibrahim Traoré did not wait for condolences. He issued blueprints. Within weeks of the ambush, the country's abandoned factories, symbols of broken promises, were repurposed. Their rusted doors opened again, this time not to import foreign machines, but to build domestic drones. Young engineers, once tempted to emigrate, now stood in repurposed labs designing wings from aluminium, cameras from salvaged tech, flight logic from sheer necessity. Each drone wasn't just a tool. It was a declaration. We will no longer beg for the means to defend our dignity. This wasn't isolation. It was engineering defiance. Traoré's response was not vengeance. It was infrastructure. And it didn't stop at drones. Operation Culpelgo followed. A national call, not to arms, but to awareness. Schools became dual-purpose centers. In the morning, education. By evening, training. Teachers taught both history and surveillance literacy. Farmers mapped terrain. Hunters taught tracking. Youth, previously unemployed, learned to manage AI-powered radar systems. This was not militarization. It was mobilization. In every village, people were reminded, sovereignty is not defended by generals alone. It is maintained by grandmothers who sew uniforms, by blacksmiths who forge helmets, by students who ask better questions. In a ceremony held in Ouagadougou, 60 saplings were planted. Each bore the name of a fallen soldier. Teachers told their students, as these trees grow, so too must your courage. Children watered them with small tin cans and promises. Meanwhile, musicians composed. Painters painted. Griots recounted the ambush not as a story of death, but of inheritance. They did not die to be mourned, one griot said. They died to be remembered with purpose. Bards turned the names of the fallen into ballads. Villagers lit candles, not for protest, but for readiness. For the first time in decades, culture was no longer a background. It became the shield. Memory became strategy. Art became a battlement. Traoré didn't stop at inspiration. He passed new procurement laws, ensuring military supply chains would favor local producers. Universities opened fellowships in national defense strategy. Legal clinics helped volunteers transition into formal defense roles. What was once considered civilian life was now linked directly to the architecture of survival. Even language changed. Citizens stopped saying, "We hope for peace." They began saying, "We are building peace." But boldness carries weight. Mobilizing civilians requires trust. Producing weapons domestically requires skill, funding, and time. One mistake, one technical failure, one political fracture could unravel it all. Critics raised hard questions. Can a nation this young sustain a strategy this bold? Can schools teach hope and surveillance at once? Can villages feed themselves while funding defense? Still, the answers kept growing. In saplings, in blueprints, in hands sewing through the night. And through it all, the doctrine began to crystallize. Sovereignty is not granted. It is defended. Security is not imported. It is built. Independence is not a slogan. It is a structure. This was no longer about an ambush. It was about transformation, from field to sky, from memory to action, from tears to tactics. But transformation attracts pressure. Whispers of sanctions, warnings from former partners, concerns voiced in diplomatic tones but lined with threat. The doctrine was rising, but so were the stakes. Will the wall built from mourning hold under the storm of geopolitics? The world watched, but it did not speak. In the aftermath of the 60 fallen soldiers, Western capitals offered condolences, but no clarity. No answers about satellite interference, no statements on aerial anomalies. No explanation for how local insurgents executed what resembled a state-grade ambush. Instead, there was silence. In contrast, another delegation arrived. Russian special forces, not as mercenaries, not under secret contracts, but under conditions set by Ouagadougou itself. No basis, no hidden agendas, just training on Burkina Faso's terms. It was a calculated signal, not a pivot to dependency, but a statement of posture. We will learn, but we will not kneel. The symbolism cut deep. In the corridors of ECOWAS and AU meetings, reactions were mixed. Some leaders saw Traoré's stance as courageous, a sovereign pushback against neo-colonial habits of security outsourcing. Others worried aloud. Will this provoke retaliation? More silence from above? In Paris, London, and Washington, think tanks issued reports concerning militarization, potential Russian influence, destabilizing doctrine. But Burkina Faso issued no replies, because to them this wasn't about East or West. It was about the ground under their feet and the sky above their heads. This was not realignment. It was realism. For Traoré, the question was never, who will protect us, but how do we protect ourselves? Africa had too long been the chessboard. It was time, he said, to become the player. And so the African doctrine of retaliation emerged, not as a manifesto against the West, but as a firewall against manipulation from any direction. A philosophy grounded in three principles: absolute defense, sovereignty. Could a fragile economy withstand pressure from traditional donors? Would sanctions follow? Would narratives be spun to discredit the movement? Already headlines hinted, Traoré's Burkina Faso drifting into authoritarianism. Yet the people responded not with fear, but with resolve. Because this was not propaganda, it was pedagogy. Burkina Faso was no longer asking, what will the West think? It was asking, what will we do if they try to stop us? And so, the lines are being redrawn, not only across borders, but across meanings. Is this resistance, or is it the first blueprint of a new African alignment? When Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood before the nation and said, build walls, not only to bury heroes, but to protect the living, he wasn't speaking of concrete and steel. He meant factories reopened for drone production. He meant classrooms that taught not just maths, but mission. He meant villagers who no longer waited for protection, but became part of it. This wall, the wall of sovereignty, was made from memory, defiance, innovation, and unity. Yet even the strongest wall can crack, and the road ahead remains full of tremors. Mobilizing civilians, arming a doctrine, and challenging global pressure is a vision bold enough to inspire, and fragile enough to collapse if mishandled. Burkina Faso still faces economic strain. Can domestic industries scale fast enough before sanctions bite? Civic fatigue. Will prolonged mobilization wear down families already living on the edge? Narrative warfare. Will the world see a sovereign experiment or an unstable regime? And yet, despite these cracks, the foundation holds, because it is not built by one man alone. It is co-authored by farmers, teachers, bards, and orphans. It is watered by 60 trees bearing the names of the fallen. It is sewn into armbands, stitched into flags, encoded into drone logic, and whispered in the songs of resistance. The doctrine, now known as African retaliation, carries within it the continent's oldest truth. Freedom is not a gift. It is a debt paid forward in vigilance. This doctrine is not just Burkina Faso's. It is a model. A blueprint not of militarization, but of mobilization, where drones fly from African soil. But will this model hold? Can Africa sustain a doctrine where dignity is defended without debt and security is sourced from within? Or will the same global forces that once redrew its borders now return to reshape its resistance? This is the question that echoes across Sahel dust and across the continent. Will Burkina Faso stand alone, or will others follow? Will this be the wall that collapses, or the wall that redefines Africa's future? 60 coffins once carried sorrow too deep for words. But today they carry something else, a doctrine, a discipline, and a dare. Under the leadership of Ibrahim Traoré, a nation refused to mourn in silence. It chose to respond with structure. From burned battlefields rose blueprints. From whispered doubts came defiant designs. This was never only about Burkina Faso. It was always about more. It was about a continent that has too long been a chessboard, too long been pitied, pressured, and positioned. Now, for the first time in a generation, the pieces move on African terms, and the world watches not in command, but in concern. Because what Ibrahim Traoré set in motion was not simply a change in military tactics. It was the birth of a new civic muscle, a wall built not with bricks, but with memory, mobilization, and meaning. Farmers mapping terrain, teachers training vigilance, grandmothers sowing resistance, children planting saplings that now grow into shields. These are not scenes of despair. They are acts of sovereignty. And this wall, fragile though it may be, now stands between a wounded past and a future still being written. The question no longer belongs to Burkina Faso alone. It belongs to Mali, to Niger, to Guinea, to the entire African family. If one small landlocked nation can resist, can remember, can rebuild, what stops the rest? Across the Sahel and far beyond, whispers turn to declarations. We are not the shadows of another's history. We are the authors of our own dawn. The African doctrine of retaliation may not be perfect. It may bend under pressure, but it was born from truth, carried by unity and fueled by memory. And for every fallen soldier, every child who dares to dream under drone-covered skies, the message echoes clear. Africa will no longer kneel. It will build. It will decide. It will rise.